morning. First, I ask your forgiveness. I do not speak Portuguese. I do not speak much of any language other than English. The two languages I have a little competence in, I don't think will work this morning either, and that is, I speak fairly fluent chimpanzee, but I won't give you a demonstration of that until later. And I was lucky enough from 1977 to 1980 to live in the Amazon, your Amazon, and live with the pre-literate tribe, the Yanomami. That experience in your country changed my life for the better. And I have a few capabilities in Yanomami, but if you allow me, I'll stick with English today. So, I think we've heard two words already this morning that are very meaningful in terms of what we want to accomplish today. One is by the great David Bowie, right? Turn and face the changes. That should be the anthem of this conference. And the other is by Daniela, when she uses the word jump. Because it's fine to turn and face the changes, but how do you approach that world of changes in a way that you relate to it as a challenge, an opportunity, not a problem? And for that, you have to muster up something in you that gives you the joy and the courage, both, to take that jump. All the while knowing that sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. But I like a quote from Samuel Beckett. And he said, try, fail, try again, fail better. And I like that quote because I'm very interested in being and attending to the real. The real is what real life is, and real life is made up of everything, not just victory, not just happiness, but everything. That's life. And that's what I'm going to try to address today, because I think that is what has to be attended to make that jump. Okay? So, I'm as I was introduced, I'm a cognitive anthropologist. So what the hell is that? I could define it sort of the way I want to, because I'm the only one. And so I define it as the study of how people make attachments to things. Attachments to anything. To people, I like him or her. I love him or her. I don't like him or her. How does that happen, actually? I like Pepsi, I don't like Coke. Or I like Coke, I don't like Pepsi. How really does that happen? And why does it happen? And when does it happen? I like this God, I don't like that God. Okay, that's what I'm interested in, all those things. And I've been studying those things for probably longer than most of you have been alive. For about 35 years. And one thing I've learned is it's a great question about how people attach to things, because you really get to the real of human life. And the real of human life is complex, emotionally based, somewhat illogical, subjective, nonlinear, symbolic, everything that we all know about what life is. The problem is that, it seems to me at least, business although gives lip service to what life is, that they fall back into assumptions about that life is linear, life is logical, life is systematic, life is non-contradictory and straightforward. Well, that's a lie. And if you adopt that lie, you're never, I guarantee you, will be able to deal with the changes. And you'll never be able to take that jump successfully. So let's at least agree to think about the real of us individually, and the real of each of you, and the real of each of everyone else. And then we're in good stead. We're in good stead. So as I travel around the world, I don't care where it is. It could be Porto Alegre. It could be Port Moresby, New Guinea. It could be Port Jefferson, New York. Everywhere. There's one underlying narrative that nowadays everyone has. Everyone. And I call that the world of two. T-O-O. People say the world is too fast, too competitive, too complex. And they're right. We all know that. And complex, I think, covers the other two. Complexity subsumes or underlies the experience of too fast and too competitive. And complexity, to me, simply means nowadays there's very few things that are straightforward, pure, and simple. This is this, and period. That's it. Nowadays, everything is a mashup. Everything is a mixture of what I call cashmere and sawdust. And that's the way it is. And the challenge is, instead of just scratching your head and saying, what the hell do I do now, is to make that jump with joy. Because if you don't make it with joy, you're not going to make it. You have to have that energy that joy gives you. And it takes energy, and it takes commitment. And the way I say it about complexity is, if Shakespeare was alive today, now I'm criticizing Shakespeare, he would have to rewrite his famous soliloquy of to be or not to be. Because the world of or is no longer with us. That's the olden days. Now we live in a world of to be and not to be. And the world of and is an interesting world, but a difficult world. And let me give you a sense of what I mean by and. One of the most precise and therefore beautiful sentences I've ever heard from anyone as I travel around the world, basically just talking to people about, tell me what your life is like nowadays. That's my only question I ever ask. I never ask questions about products or anything like that. I just ask, tell me something about what your life is like nowadays. And then my only smart thing I do is shut up and listen. I don't have a million other questions. I follow their lead. They don't follow my lead, people I talk to. And the one sentence that I love the most that I've heard over the years, recent years, is, quote, nowadays, things are always advancing, getting better, sometimes for the worse. And that little conundrum is the existence that we all live in today. Another example is when I, about 1989, a little after the fall of the Soviet Union, I was asked by the U.S. government to go to Russia and talk to people about what's life is like nowadays. And I heard this amazing sentence, which is very precise about to represent people's experience. And they said, talking about the end of the Soviet Union, they said, well, things are better now, but they weren't worse then. So how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with all of complexity? Well, I've taken a stance about this, started about a couple of years ago, and I said, I'm going to take some of my time and I'm going to try to understand artists of every kind, movie directors, actors, architects, novelists, choreographers, chefs, because my intuition was, well, artists create new. So how did they do it? And maybe I could learn something from that. And why I did that was just I was following an inner impulse. That's all I could say. I had no good rationale for it other than I must do it. And that turned out to be one of the lessons in talking to artists. They follow their intuition. They follow their unconscious. So I started this journey, and I was lucky enough through certain contacts I had, and I have some quotes here I'll recite to you. I ended up talking to many, many types of artists, some very famous, and some not very famous, but good. Just for example, talking about following your unconscious. So a couple of years ago, there was a novelist, Donna Tartt. She wrote the best-selling novel that year in the world, Goldfinch. It's a great story. I recommend it. But more importantly, for our purposes this morning, she says, she's talking about her writing. She says, that's the way it's been with me with all my books. Things will come to me, and I'm not really going to know exactly how they're going to fit in her writing. I have to trust that they will fit in, or I'll see how they don't fit in. And I have to trust that my unconscious knows what the hell it's doing. And I would suggest your unconscious does know what it's doing, because it's your unconscious. There's something in you that's telling you something. Listen to that. I have to trust that my unconscious knows what the hell it's doing. That only comes from first being open to what you feel. Feel. I wrote a book in 2012 about that, feel. And when I finished writing the manuscript, it was 74,000 words, so I checked word count. Because in my book contract, it says minimum of 70,000 words. So I let it be for about a week, and then I came back to it, and in one sitting, I read through it on my computer before I sent it to my publisher. And my impression was, I like it. However, I can replace these 74,000 words. This is what I'm saying to myself. I can replace these 74,000 words with 3 words. Live in feeling. Not live with feeling. Live in it. You are your own environment. That's what I mean by live in feeling. And that idea of what I would call, and I called in that book, sensuality. Be open to recognize your own experience of your own experience. What do a lot of people you ask, well, what are you feeling now? And they'll either say nothing, or they'll say, describe what they're doing. Like, oh, I'm sitting in a chair listening to this guy babble. Okay? I'm not asking that. I'm asking, what are you feeling? And you have to be open to that constant stream of information that's about you. Your feelings tell you about you. And without knowing about you, you're not going to make that jump. Or you're going to make it in a way that's going to be somewhat unproductive. So, there's like 5 concepts or 6 concepts I'd like to mention today. So one is this idea of feeling, sensuality. That underlies everything. Okay? Keep on pinching yourself. You know, how do you feel? But the idea is to learn and be in touch with your own self. If you don't have a narrative of self and an appreciation of self, you're going to be a flag in the wind. And the winds in this complex time of changes are too strong for you to hold yourself against it without having some notion of self. So I'll talk about that in a moment. What self helps you do is a couple of things. One, it helps you be a metaphor maker. A metaphor maker. Every artist I spoke to didn't talk about that. None of them said, I'm a metaphor maker. But they all talk in metaphorical terms. This is like this. Okay? Metaphor is simple. It doesn't it doesn't refer to poetry, really. It refers to the idea of, I have 2 things. I have one thing here that I know. I have one thing here that I don't know. So I'm going to move what I know onto what I don't know and call what I don't know by the name of what I know. That's metaphor. And artful thinking is pervaded, is rife with metaphorical thinking. It's the real trampoline that helps you make that jump. The other thing that self and sensuality and metaphor help you with is dealing with paradox. Everything now, as I'm saying, is contradictory, or most everything. This idea of cashmere and sawdust. Artful thinkers seem to be able to integrate contradictory ideas by using metaphor. You know, they look at 2 things that are seemingly on the surface opposite, but they go deep. They go underneath the surface. What's the real meaning of those things? What's the real conceptual idea underneath those things? And then let's see if, and sometimes there's not, but a lot of times there is. Let's see if there's any underlying commonality that we could generate something new from that's not A, that's not B, that generates something new but doesn't negate A or B. That's dealing with paradox. And there are exercises one can do, and there's an attitude one could have about dealing with complexity in terms of dealing with paradox that are helpful. So self, metaphor, paradox. Those are the main things. But there's 3 other things that help that other stuff. One is, let's call it risk-taking. But what I mean by risk-taking is collaborate with chance. Okay, a lot of things happen by chance because life is a constant source of surprise. But you're not reacting to it as just, I got to follow the chaos. You're reacting to it as, okay, this happened. Now, how do I feel about it? What about it surprises me? What about it do I like? What about it do I hate? What about it am I confused about? What am I attracted to about it? Right? And you're buffeted this way and that, but you take some control by being in collaboration with that surprise, that chance. So you insinuate yourself into it. It's not just, there's a word, at least in English, serendipity. So serendipity comes from the Sanskrit word serendripa. And serendripa is a family who lives in what used to be called Ceylon, and they're on an elephant, and they're making a trip to visit their families, and they get lost, and they have all these crazy experiences. But I'm not talking about serendipity. I'm talking about not following the elephant, but given you a lost and you're on the elephant, have him, at least in part, have him or her do something and go in a direction you want to go in, not what it wants to go in. Okay, so, and the next thing is just collaborate. Every artist I spoke to who's singularly world famous, right? Springsteen, Paul Simon, Wynton Marsalis, Pharrell, David Bowie, all talk about, well, I might be front stage, and I'm the guy or the gal, but there's a lot of people helping me. And collaboration is fun, and it's great. There's a story that Herbie Hancock, the great jazz pianist and composer, tells about, that he was once part of the Miles Davis group, and they were playing a concert in Amsterdam, and everything was like really working that night, and all the musicians knew it. Sometimes it's just happening, and they feel it. And Herbie had a short solo piece as a lead-in to a Miles Davis solo, a long solo. And Herbie Hancock tells the story of he hit a wrong note in that lead-in to Miles' solo. And what Miles Davis did was not say, oh, shit. What he did was he created a new solo as a provocation to that mistake right on the spot. So I could talk personally for myself. I'm no Miles Davis. But that's a model of even an error, even a mistake, even something goes wrong, can be a provocation to your own imagination, your own creativity, and your own way of taking the jump. You never know where it comes from. So I like that story. Another quote I have that's special for me, because a lot of people say, well, it's fine for you to talk about these kind of things, but I have a job to do. That to me is bad faith. The job you have as a human being is to realize the truth, the authenticity of what you are and what's in you, and in that way help bring out everyone else's authenticity. That's your job as a person, as a human being. Your job is not to enact the rules, the doctrines, the dogmas, the crap that a lot of business is immersed in. You have to find your own way. Dustin Hoffman, the great actor, says, a movie script only places you in the territory, right? Then you have to find your way by finding you in the script. If you're just a reader of a script, you're not an actor. You're a reader. And I would say the same thing for any profession. Any profession. I don't care if you're president of the world or you do something less than that. I still say that's your job. to find what's in you, and also in that way help others find their way, their you. Right? Because there's a funny thing, which is just part of human nature. A vital life that's bubbling up and dealing with all those changes and having fun, a vital life vitalizes everything around it. When you're in the presence of a vital person who's truly alive, you become more truly alive. So there's a social function, not just a selfish function, to attending to self. And what are we talking about? We're talking about discovery, right? Artists' only agenda really is discovery. And that's what we're talking about today, whether we call ourselves artists in any sense of the word. And we all should, or we all could, really. It's not, that's a better way of saying it. We all could live up to that idea of what I call artful thinking. Albert Einstein, okay, scientist, so-called objective, rigorous, all those words of science. And sometimes they apply. But here's what Einstein said in 1945 at Princeton University when he's giving a speech about how he came up with his ideas. And he said, "Words or data, as they are logically written or spoken, do not seem to play any role in my thought. My thinking is visual and muscular in type. It originates from the intuition of my body. My body." So granted, you have to have you can't just, know nothing and say, what do I feel, and come up with great ideas necessarily. You have to have some expertise and some knowledge. But then you sort of let that go and feel and transform knowledge that you know into something different from what the knowledge is. There's a beautiful poem about this that if you want, I'll send to you if you write me, by Rilke. It's called Blood Memory, or you could look it up for yourself. It's just an amazing series of thoughts. But this idea of real imagination, real creativity, is not a matter of what you know. I can know everything there is to know about neuroscience or about anthropology. I don't, but let's say I do. Well, what am I then? I'm an encyclopedia. Big deal. To deal with complexity, to make that jump, you have to pass your knowledge through the sieve of the self. And then the self refracts that knowledge into all kinds of things, and that's the beginning of an idea, a new idea, a creative idea. So it's not what you know, it's how you pass what you know through the idea, the narrative of self. That's a key. So I had this intuition about speaking to artists, and now, a couple of years later, I'm glad I did. Because, first of all, I realized that art, the best definition of art that I now can conceive of, given I've spoken to all these artists, and also read about a lot of artists, and seen other interviews of artists that I haven't done, art is anything which makes the viewer, or the hearer, or the experiencer of that thing have a slightly expanded vision, an idea of the world and their world. So art functions as a self-expansion. You know, I see the world one way now, I have an experience of something, and now I see it slightly differently. And you have to have a lot of different experiences to be able to take that jump again with joy. See it as an opportunity, not as a problem. An author, a novelist I love, Annie Dillard, says it this way. She's talking about writing, but you could be applied to anything. Your work is to keep cranking the flywheel that turns the gears, that spins the belt in the engine of belief that keeps you and your desk in mid-air. That's where you have to be to face the changes and make the jump. You have to be in mid-air. And when you have that experience, it's not constant, but it's usually fleeting. But when you have it, you know you're in it. And then what you know is, as Goethe once said, who ever expected the days to be God's? When you're in midair, you are a god or a goddess. And unless you have some of those experiences that are like that, the complexity will get to you. You won't get to it. It'll get to you. And for that, you have to really find a way to understand, explore, expand your own self, your own feelings about things. You know, I think about this as, it's like the movie Star Wars, the original movie, makes me think of this idea of self, believe it or not. To me, the story of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader is a story of not succumbing to the system. And Darth Vader, of course, represents the system. Closed, heartless, angry, defensive. And the opposition to that is what we need to be. Feel the force, but feel the force within you. Don't feel my force. It doesn't do anything for you, as yours doesn't do anything for me. Feel your force. You know, all the mythologies of the Grail, the Holy Grail, there's a million interpretations of this, but I'm convinced that the only valid interpretation of the story and the mythologies of the Holy Grail is the Grail is a person, any person, who is acting out of their own center, acting out of their own authenticity, and using that and growing from that. So it's an interesting thing to look at. And one thing you have to do, I think, to be able to get there, and to continue to be able to get there, the journey's never finished, no matter how well you're into it or how well you're not into it. But I like the designer, Charles Ames. He designed that Ames chair, and he designed a lot of branding work. Very genius guy. And he has a great concept that I think about a lot. And he calls it delicious agony. Now, there's a paradox for you. And he says, I have to take a naive stance. I have to trust my own visceral bodily feeling and my own authenticity, which includes all my imperfections, to get through the journey from not knowing to partial knowing. Okay? He doesn't say from not knowing to knowing. He says, from not knowing to partial knowing, because you never know everything. And he says, that's a gamble, as opposed to just saying, I know what I know, and I'm going to just get the answer, right? He says, if you take that gamble of the visceral experience of going from not knowing to partial knowing, then you come to endure that most wonderful experience, which he calls delicious agony. So I wish you all delicious agony of life. I think it's a very important concept, because it simply means everything is not hunky-dory. Everything is not easy. Everything is not happy. It's hard dealing with complexity. It's hard to create something new. But what are you here for? What are you alive for? Well, I'll tell you what you're not here for, if I can do that. What you're not here for, as a human being, any human being, is to live a life on autopilot. You know? Turn the switch to, let's continue doing what we always do. We don't have to attend to anything. Everything is familiar, everything is routine, everything is a reenactment of yesterday, and I can relax. That's autopilot. I can't tell you how many people around the world that I've spoken to, without any prompting by me, and all I say is, tell me something about what your life is like nowadays. Talk about, unelicited by me, how they're living a life on autopilot, and how separated they feel from the distance between what they do, particularly at work, and who they are as a person. That's a disease. That will lead to sickness. And it doesn't need to be. That disease could end, that pandemic can end right now just by you taking a stance. Everyone taking a stance about their own self. Let me quote one more person here in this moment. Jim Carrey. If you know him, he's a very well-known actor and comedian. And I really like something he said, because I think it's true. He said, the safe road, the road of autopilot, is going, most of the time, it'll pay off. Because you'll fit in to what already is. But I can't be there, he says. I can't do that and have myself, my soul, on a completely different track. Risking for your soul is always worth it. I live in that area. I will expand myself. I like that. So at this point, let me stop for a moment with quotes and show you a short 2-minute video of Pharrell, the singer-songwriter, who I suspect most of you, if not all of you, know of. In this video, Pharrell is doing a masterclass with a young singer-songwriter, and I just have a short clip of it, just at the end of her performance that they're listening to on record. He's sitting next to her. Her name is Maggie Rogers. And I want you to hear what he says. So could I have the Pharrell video, please? That's Maggie. This is the end of the song. There's the man.
have zero notes for that. And I'll tell you why. It's because you're doing your own thing. It's singular. It's
Do
like
your
when
own
the
thing.
Wu-Tang Clan came out, like no one could really judge it. You either liked it or you didn't, but you couldn't compare it to anything else. And that is such a special quality, and all of us possess that ability, but you have to be willing to seek, and you have to be willing to be like real frank in your music and frank in your choices. And sometimes like most of the time people will say, okay, I'm gonna make this kind of song, so it ends up sounding like something we've heard before or felt before, and I feel like what your whole story, I can hear it in the music. I can hear the journey of like you having that kind of background, and then I love your singer-songwriter verses, which singer-songwriters are the best to me. Like I love them, That's what I love about Stevie Wonder's music, because as much as his music was huge in pop, he was a singer-songwriter. He really told stories. Yeah. And I felt that just then, but but I've never heard anyone like you before, and I've never heard anything that sounds like that. So that is the kind of thing that that's a drug for me. So that was cool. And I'd be very curious to see what your visuals will look like, because you seem to know what you...
So, seek you. Seek what's inside you. Right? Be frank with yourself. Go for the real. You. And in that way, his third word is be singular. Don't do what he does. Don't do what she does. Don't do what your company does. Don't do what your boss does. Don't do what. Do you. And I believe that's the best way to face the changes, productively, for everybody. For everybody. So let me say now a moment about metaphor, other than what I said. One of the funnest, if that's a word, one of the most fun stories I heard about metaphor, talking to artists, was from Paul Simon. And he was talking about the making of the album Graceland, the album he partly made in South Africa, about South Africa, with South African musicians. And he only made 3 tracks in South Africa. He came back and wrote the rest here. And when he came back, he had this idea, he had this phrase in his head, I'm going to Graceland. And he said to himself, what the hell is this that I have in my head? This album has nothing to do with Graceland, has nothing to do with Elvis, has nothing to do with Memphis, and I can't seem to get it out of my head. So he says, well, I kept on trying for months to literally erase this phrase from my head. It was like a mantra that was a monster in my body. And then he couldn't rid himself of it. So then he says, well, I said to myself, I guess I have to make a trip to Graceland and find out while I'm writing this album. Right? So that's another example to begin with of trust your unconscious. He said, well, maybe there's something about this idea of Graceland that I'm not getting, that I should be getting. So he went down to Memphis. He went down to New Orleans to cut a Zydeco track. And then he drove up Highway 61 into Memphis. Along the Mississippi River. And he immediately had this sentence in his head, instantaneously, right? The Mississippi Delta is shining like a national guitar. That's the first sentence of the song Graceland in the album Graceland, right? That sold 235 million copies. Okay. And it's a metaphor, right? The Mississippi River is a national guitar. You bring one thing to be another thing, and then you discover something. And he said what he discovered in his own mind when he had that sentence, and he wouldn't have had that sentence, he says, if he didn't make that drive into Memphis. He discovered why he's doing this album. He said part of the history of rock and roll came from jazz and blues, and part of jazz and blues came from Africa, and I'm trying to return the favor. Now, I'm taking my version of rock and roll and bringing it back into an African aesthetic. And then once he said that, then the other cuts on the album came pretty quickly. So that, if you really think about it, I mean, that's an amazing story of how the mind works. And how the mind works if you let it work, like the way it should, the way it's meant to work. You know, the mind is pretty amazing. Let it be. Respect it. You know, rightly or wrongly, I had that intuition for myself about, well, I'm going to try to study artists and people who think artfully, and maybe I'll get somewhere in dealing with complexity, right? And I think I have, but even if I haven't, in the act of doing that, man, it's taken me on the most amazing journey. I've learned a lot about myself, as everyone does when they're in this dynamic of artful thinking, right? Let me relate what I'm saying to some very practical terms, in terms of marketing even. As far as I'm concerned, the marketing industry has somewhat of an erroneous concept of what brand is. Because they don't really, marketing and business in general doesn't deal with real people. They have no interest in real people. And they have no interest in being real people. They have interest in being marketers and thinking about people only as consumers. Well, there's one thing I could guarantee you, that if you think of people only as consumers, you're not going to get very far with understanding people and dealing with life and dealing with complexity. People are at one and the same time, as I said, more complex, more magnificent, more majestic, more stupid, more courageous, and all the rest than any consumer could ever be conceived of. So again, stick with real life. And the first way to stick with real life is pay attention to your own real life, your own inner life, your own thinking, feeling life. And you'll see, wow. It's a ride. It's a journey. It's fabulous. Even when it's terrible, it's fabulous. So, most marketing, I think, thinks of branding as name recognition plus positive attributes associated with name recognition. Well, if you really think about how people operate and how people, what I call, attach to things, no one in the history of the human species has ever gone for something based on that definition. Only robots do it that way. People don't do it that way. Brand, if you listen to how people and watch how people attach to things, brand only happens under one condition, and only one condition. And that is when any person can metaphorically merge the story they have of themselves with the story they have of the product. And that's a construction that people make. And the best you could do as a marketer is pretty good, is help gird, support, evoke that process, and then let it go. That's branding. That's attachment. That's brings an experience by a person that says, that product is me. It's not, I like that product. That's nothing. That's commodity. But that product is me. That's everything. Because you can't reject it, because if you reject it, you reject yourself. And it usually has very little to do with product attributes. You know? It's like, I was surprised but interested in a couple of years ago during the so-called Arab Spring, when the protesters were in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and they weren't chanting, I want better jobs, I want better housing, I want a better car, I want this, I want that. They weren't saying that. You know what they were chanting? Literally, they were chanting in their language, I am me. Recognize me as a human being. And that's what we all want. We want to be recognized, and we want to expand, self-expand. We all want that. I find very instructive the Walt Disney story of Pinocchio. You know the story of Pinocchio? The wooden puppet who has a long nose and comes to life? Well, that's an interesting story, because to me it's about a process, about a person becoming real. So that's what I'm talking about. And to become real, you have to go through your own trials and tribulations. You have to go through your own self and how you deal with life. Then you'll come closer to realizing what it means to be a real person. And the only way, again, I think, that one can turn and face the changes, deal with complexity in a joyful, expectant way, all the while knowing you might fail, because you're a real person and you recognize real life, is to go for the real. Go for the real in you, recognize the real in others, and the real in others, most of the time, that's compelling, are imperfections of people, not perfections. Look at me, I'm great. You know, it's like, okay, that could produce awe, like, wow, look at that. But as soon as that message is off the screen, whatever the screen is, the idea of it is off your mind. But you find a little imperfection, a little detail of real human life that your body tells you that's real. That stays with you. And to render that in an artful way to an audience, even in the service of your client, is making magic. So let me end this way, because I see time is running quickly, and the world is too fast. I asked for 4 hours, they gave me less than an hour. Thank you. I want to end referencing first Bruce Springsteen and the Beatles. So Bruce has a beautiful soliloquy about paradox, and it's in relation to what you have to be as a human being, as a self, to succeed creatively. And I'm telling you something, my personal opinion, about Bruce Springsteen. You know, he's called the boss. Well, as far as I'm concerned, he's the model of the benevolent boss. He has expertise. He has compassion. He is able to be a witness, I call it a witness, to himself and to others, and to give back those observations in a way to other people that they could feel or see or imagine that they have more options in life that they now think they have. So that, to me, is a real boss. That's the best you could have as a boss. So Bruce says this about how to be a real person, and he's talking about paradox. Quote, don't take yourself too seriously, and take yourself as seriously as death itself. That's number one. And he's talking about both. Don't worry. Worry your ass off. Quote. Have ironclad confidence, but doubt. Doubt keeps you awake and keeps you alert. You don't know it all. I constantly hear artists, and now I try to tell myself, oh, I know something about this. Yeah, you know maybe a little bit, but you don't know much of anything, Bob. Keeps you open. Believe you're the baddest ass in town, and you suck. Quote. Lastly, be able to keep two completely contradictory ideas, that's what we're talking about, complexity, be able to keep two completely contradictory ideas alive and well inside your head and, he says, your heart at the same time. If it doesn't make you crazy, it'll make you strong. And it'll probably make you both. Those are wise words. Come from someone who's been around, has the hard times, has the good times, has the stupid times, has the smart times. I really love that. He also says, on this, now I'm talking about business for a second. I don't like to talk about business. I like to talk about life. But here's a quote from Bruce that I think relates to business. This was in an article about him in the New York Times. And the article was called Right Place, Right Time. And that's very important. You could have a great brand idea. If you don't have it in the right place at the right time, it sucks. Okay? Quote, it's the way you blend in with the times, and how you see yourself in those times. How you contextualize your work and your idea of who you are and what your work is. And also how you experience yourself as a person and as a citizen of the world. If all those things fit, those are the opportunities for a very heightened kind of communication. And it starts with the self and ends with finding a way, metaphorically, I think, to connect with the times. Whatever you want to call the times. I call it the world of two. You could call it anything, complexity. You could call it pain in the butt. You know what some people call, I asked some people, like, what would you give the name to the context of the world today? And the most clever answer I've heard all over the world is, the name of the current context of the world is, I don't know the name of the current context of the world. That's the name of the current context of the world. Right? We're between mythologies, as I said. We're not what we once were, and we are not yet what we will become. So we have to see. But what we do now will determine what we become. So lastly, I refer to the Beatles. A couple of months ago, I went to see the Ron Howard documentary on the Beatles called Hard Day's Night. I recommend it highly. Not only it's fun, whether you like the Beatles or not, it's a fun story. And there's some little gems of life in there that are really fabulous. And near the end of the documentary, a journalist is asking Paul McCartney, well, did you realize in the act of becoming and being the Beatles, you were changing culture? And Paul sort of laughed, and said, no, we weren't really aware of that. What we were doing is three things, which I recommend to everyone. He says, number one, we were true to ourselves and true to each other. Even when we were arguing, we were truthful. Be real. Two, we had fun. And when we stopped having fun, mostly because the crowds in the stadiums were just something they couldn't deal with, then we stopped. Because our idea was we could be the best we could be if in process we were having fun being that. True. For everyone. And three, he said, we always try to evolve both professionally, musically, and personally, right? We never had any desire to stay in our familiar. We only wanted to grow. And that was the real impetus for things like going to India and stuff like that. So, get out of your familiar. Be a holy grailer. Search, discover, seek, be frank with yourself. And have fun. So I'd like to end by quoting three short sentences from a Beatles song called In the End. And I'd like to ask this great musical group that was entertaining you before to come and help me, because I have a lousy voice. So could I ask you great guys to come out? Thank you. So let me recite the words first, and then I'll ask these people to render it in a beautiful way. And of course the words are, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make in this world. That's the credo, I would venture to say, of people who think artfully. Their motive, their way of thinking about giving love is serve others. Serve others in a way that helps them, as I said, realize that there are bigger options in the world than what they might experience now. Help them realize that the gallantness, the courage that they exhibit every day in living just an everyday life, which is difficult enough, is heroic. And it is. And artists, I think, both unconsciously and consciously, the best ones, along with everything else I've talked about, like having fun in process, are really after to serve others. The way, for example, Bruce Springsteen does, I would say, as being a witness. So, take it away.
And in the end, the life you take is equal to the love you make.
Bravo! So, one last sentence. Literally, this is the last sentence. If you do that, which they just gave beautiful voice to, I think you will find that you reap rewards even more than awards. Business and the industry we're particularly in, I think, are a little too obsessed with awards. And they're fine, but they should come first from you and others that are your audience to finding awards. So, I wish you artful thinking, and I thank you. And I thank you.